Hey, it's Kay, and this is Skittles, Event Coordinator. A couple years ago, I made a 4-part series of videos about the legend of Korra. Each video explored one of the 4 seasons and how they interact with different political ideologies. Perhaps the most contentious of those videos, judging by the comments, was the video for Season 1 that posits that Amon and the Equalists are being used as a narrative tool to discuss communism and anti-capitalism more broadly. It wasn't a huge surprise then when another YouTuber made a response video to my first Korra video, and it touched on a lot of common ideas that I noticed in the comments of that video over the years. So I wanted to do a response to the response, a re-response to Hello Future Me's "Is Amon a Communist?"
Oh, this is Amon.
He's a communist.
Oh, really?
Yep, big communist. Big communist.
Oh.
Now, HFM does not think we should be treating the first season of Korra as a text that is discussing communism. He makes 2 main arguments for that, which I'm going to take a look at in this video.
I've got some literature in my car that will change your whole way of thinking.
Talk to me, baby.
The first argument is that the criticisms the show makes of Amon are different than the criticisms that opponents of communism tend to make about communism. The second argument is that Amon's beliefs do not line up with actual communist beliefs. So, here's the fun part. I'm going to argue that the first argument is incorrect, but the second argument is in fact true, and why that matters. So argument number 1 goes like this. The things Amon is critiqued for and the things communism is critiqued for are not the same, so we shouldn't be looking at Season 1 of Korra as a critique of communism. HFM says this.
This story is about losing part of what makes you who you are, your abilities, personality, your interests, and Amon is framed as someone who is designed to take those personal things away from us. The story framework itself only works because it's aimed at critiquing a kind of collectivism that communism is not critiqued for, defining and demonizing people by their immutable, unchangeable traits, namely whether they are non-benders or benders. Saying that communists target rich people for things they can't control was not and never has been a critique of communist philosophy, even from its opponents.
So I want to take this in 2 halves. The argument that magical powers are not the exact same as accumulated money and property, as an argument that one does not serve as an allegory for the other, already puts us in a really difficult place in terms of trying to analyze any media at all. There's some key differences between Narnia's Aslan and Jesus, including, but not limited to, being an immortal lion who battles witches in an obnoxious twee pocket dimension he made for some reason, but we don't contest that Aslan is a Christ allegory. Being gay is not a mutant power that makes you shoot beams out of your eyes or control metal, nor does being a mutant alter your sexuality in any way. But we accept that X-Men stories often use mutants as an allegory for gay people. Now that might be a bit of a messy allegory, but it's an allegory. They use something in-universe to tell a story that conveys ideas about something in the real world. Open and shut case. None of those things would work, however, if we used an approach to literary analysis that posits that because something is not a perfect one-to-one parallel, that it cannot be representative of that thing. And it leads to missing some really interesting ideas present in a text. For example, HFM uses the Empire in Star Wars as an example of something having only an aesthetic resemblance to real-world groups, so we shouldn't treat them as representative of those groups.
The Empire in Star Wars uses Nazi imagery to invoke certain connotations, feelings, but that doesn't mean that it's a one-to-one allegory. Darth Vader having a redemption at the end isn't saying Hitler's right-hand man Heinrich Himmler eventually redeemed himself. No!
But aesthetically designing the Empire to evoke the Nazis serves a purpose other than just look at these bad guys, because the Empire simultaneously serves as commentary about America, specifically in Vietnam, which George Lucas had a lot of strong opinions about, as did many at the time. You might have heard of it. So when the Empire simultaneously evokes the image of a well-funded advanced army terrorizing a less technologically advanced group of rebels in a jungle, while also dressed as Nazis, This is maybe saying some things about American empire. I don't think it's good enough to say, well, they aren't a historical parallel to the Nazis, so we should only consider this a surface-level association. But back to the idea that bending can't be a stand-in for economic power because it works differently. This relies on a Thermian argument. A Thermian argument is the use of an in-universe explanation to dismiss criticism about something in a work of art, often something politically contentious. A great example of a Thermian argument is when people criticized Hideo Kojima for making the character Quiet, who goes on important military operations dressed like this and does whatever this is. And he replied, actually, it's because she breathes through her skin. Quiet isn't real. She was made by people and designed to look a certain way on purpose. Whatever criticisms people had of her design still stand whether or not Kojima decided to have an in-universe reason for it. Which, to be clear, is way weirder than just having a half-naked lady in your game because you want to. It's not like you would have been the first. In fact, while we're on the topic, another classic Thermian argument is the anime girl who looks about 8 years old, but we're assured she's actually a 900-year-old dragon in human form, which means you can't call the FBI. While the Thermian argument HFM is using definitely shouldn't get him put on the list like that last one, it functions the same way, using a canonical detail to insist that a criticism is invalid. It would be really bizarre and heavy-handed writing if the bending in this show somehow worked exactly like capital accumulation. It is not necessary or even desirable for the allegory to be that exact. But by expecting it to be, we prime ourselves to reject anything but the most literal interpretations of a text, which completely shuts us off from asking questions about what sorts of ideas the stories we enjoy are really conveying to us. The second half of this argument, we'll call it argument 1B, that last one was 1A, is the assertion that what Amon is doing is taking away a fundamental part of someone, steals what makes them who they are, their individuality, which HFM says is not something communism is criticized for. And boy, have I got a film for you. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a movie from the 50s that features alien plant pods that create perfect physical duplicates of people, which they use to replace them and slowly invade the Earth. You might have seen its popular 70s remake, if not the original film itself. This movie is infamously discussed as both an anti-communist and anti-McCarthyist text, depending who you ask. Many argue the pods are an allegory for communism, a looming collectivism that threatens American society and threatens to take away your individuality, everything that makes you who you are. And many argue that the response to the pods represents the paranoia and panic that dominated McCarthyist America, a time when people were trying to turn their neighbors in for being communists.
They're here already! You're next!
While many treat this as a competition to figure out which meaning the film conveys, both of them are perfectly valid readings, with plenty to evidence them in the text. It's doing both at the same time. To make matters more interesting, director Don Siegel can be found frequently insisting he intended no political messages in this movie. A film about a secret invasion that takes away your individuality, your very personhood, and the paranoia that tore society apart as a result, that came out at the height of the Cold War, represented by this poster from the time containing primarily the colors red and yellow, in which our protagonists are seen running from an encroaching red abyss. That movie. No political messages. Oh hey, I'm McCarthy. This should make us think twice about treating the author as an absolute authority on the meaning of a text. And I bring this up because HFM references the boys who created Avatar several times in this video. We should also be curious about whether they might have an external motivation to insist their work isn't taking any particular political stance in interviews, when their primary goal is to promote what they've made and get people of all political views to go see it. Is it possible that artists sometimes aren't fully honest about their beliefs in an effort to not alienate segments of their audience? Whenever you find a movie that deals in political issues, there's a good chance you'll find a quote from the writer or director insisting they aren't saying anything political. It's not just movies, it happens all the time in video games, too. Take 6 Days in Fallujah, for example. If you take what anyone who makes a piece of art says about it as gospel, you'll find yourself arguing there's absolutely nothing political about this game set in one of the most politically controversial and ugly chapters of the Iraq War. Already an extremely controversial and ugly chapter in and of itself. Come on. Who functions as a protagonist in your story? Who functions as an antagonist? Which details do you choose to focus on? Which get neglected? All of these are massively political statements when discussing subject matter like that. After getting some heat for claiming their Iraq war game was not political, the publisher said, okay, yeah, of course it's political. So that first statement wasn't true. Anyway, isn't it curious how despite the author totally not intending any of this, tons and tons of people saw the pod people in Invasion of the Body Snatchers and said, yep, that's communism. To the extent that whether the film is coming out against communism more or McCarthyism more is still a prominent debate. Because contrary to what HFM says, the supposed loss of individuality has always been a primary critique of collectivist ideologies, such as communism. In fact, here's serious brain man Jordan Peterson making this exact argument in a talk about the resurgence of Marxism among young people.
There's no sovereign individuals. Your group identity is paramount. You have no unique voice. You're a mouthpiece of your identity group.
It's not a good criticism. It's not a criticism that is hard to refute, but it is a common criticism. And Korra is completely in line with a long history of anti-communist tropes by using it. But let's back up a second. We should briefly address death of the author. If we shouldn't always take what the author says as the last word on what a text has to say, then how do we know what stories are about? Is it just whatever we want? What's to stop me saying Harry Potter is meant to be an allegory for when people get mad at you on Twitter for saying awful garbage, and even the cast of the film adaptations don't want to associate with you? Well, I'm so glad I said you asked that question, because literary criticism is a massive field, and there's been tons of ideas and debate and scholarly work on that question. I am partial to a school of thought called Structuralism, which posits that the meaning of a text cannot be divorced from the material conditions it exists in. That is to say, the political, economic, and cultural conditions of the real world in which that text was created and received by us, the audience. So when I argued it was fair to read ideas about communism and McCarthyism into Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that was because of the time and place it was created, and how the themes and imagery utilized in the movie related to those things going on in the real world. You know, allegory ways. So let's take that and bring it back to Korra. The first season of Korra came out in mid-2012. What was going on in the world at that point? Well, notably, the Occupy movement had seen its peak in the previous year. For any viewers who are too young to properly remember, or who might be from a part of the world where it wasn't as prominent in the news, between 2010 and 2011, the anti-austerity protests that had been simmering since the 2008 crash morphed into something massive that would eventually be called Occupy. Though it was very messy and not what any Marxists in the audience would call a coherent anti-capitalist platform, it was part of a massive resurgence in socialist talking points and perspective in discussing class.
Because if you asked the 99% of us, we wouldn't choose a society where America has 700,000 homeless children.
The 99% and the 1% was the closest that popular discussion of the economy had come to talking about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie since the USSR fell in the 90s. The past 20 years had been largely vacant of this way of looking at capitalism. So we've got a time when criticism of capitalism is making a comeback, people are still skeptical of the system after 2008, mass protests and condemnations of an oppressor class of haves versus the have-nots are on TV all the time, everywhere you look. This was huge news. You couldn't get away from it. The boys would have been writing the first season of Korra at the height of this. When considering the political context in which this text was created, it is ludicrous to expect us to look at the use of communist imagery and talking points that HFM himself concedes are present in the show and dismiss them as simply aesthetic similarities. at a time when it was more popular than it had been in at least a generation to talk about class struggle, you cannot say this story about a popular uprising against a ruling class has nothing to do with any of this. These protests are seen by many as part of a catalyst that led to the resurgence of Marxism among young people, that Jordy Peets was lamenting earlier. So we've covered HFM's first argument and found that Amon does in fact do things communism is criticized for, sensibly or not. But now I want to take a look at the second primary argument HFM makes. Amon's beliefs don't line up with communism in the first place. HFM does something I actually really like here and compares Amon's ideology to strasserism, a Nazi ideology that attempted to recuperate communist rhetoric at a time in Germany when communism was very popular, but unfortunately, anti-Semitism was even more popular.
It's a populist ideology that classifies Jews as a, quote, economic elite because of their supposed inherent traits. Obviously, Amon describing benders as impure rings a lot more familiar here.
Strasserism took narratives about class conflict and polluted them with a racial element, which HFM points out is kind of reflected in Amon's bizarre language when he refers to bending as an impurity.
It only took a few moments for me to cleanse them of their impurity.
Yeah, it's pretty weird. HFM is completely correct when he says Amon's beliefs don't line up with communism, and if anything, they're more similar to strasserism. And I believe that is a far greater argument in favor of the conclusion of my original video on the series than it is an argument against it. Here's the thing. Very few works that critique communism do so by accurately representing communist beliefs. Just take a look back at that Jordan Peterson clip from earlier. That's from an hour-long talk in which he wildly misrepresents Marxism, which he can't even seem to parse from identity politics. That's not just on him, though. Most political critique engages in some amount of misrepresenting or being as ungenerous as possible to their political opponents. Everyone does this. It's like the first rule of politics. But how many people know what strasserism is? Let's once again apply a structuralist method here. It's 2012, just past the height of these massive worldwide protests against wealth inequality, against key aspects of class society. They are still fresh in your memory, and you watch a TV show in which the antagonist presents himself as an opponent of this ruling class, his followers mirroring a lot of the images you'd seen around the Occupy protests. Then it turns out he's operating out of a personal hate for this ruling class, and even uses some Nazi-esque language about them being impure, while absolutely terrifying our protagonist, who's like a teenager. Are you, the average viewer, thinking, wow, what a Strasserite? Or are you maybe thinking twice about some of the rhetoric you'd been hearing from those protests? Do you think it says anything that the guy who spends so much of the show talking about equality and being contextualized with communist imagery also has a weird racial element to his views? Especially given that, as HFM points out, he and Tarlok seem to mirror each other in so many ways. Tarlok in this case representing a much more overtly fascistic position than Amon. In fact, this demonstrates the presence, in Season 1 of Korra, of another classic anti-communist trope that I pointed out in my original video, Horseshoe theory. It was Horseshoe theory the whole time, baby! The idea that the far left and far right have more in common with each other than us sensible people in the middle. In fact, HFM himself plays into this somewhat earlier in his video when he suggests Amon only appears to represent communism because he is a populist, a sociological umbrella term so broad that it includes any political narrative that positions a group of elites against the rest of society. Meaning anyone from Lenin to Hitler to Donald Trump can all be placed under the same classification, with no regard for whether the elite group in question is actually real or not. To clarify, the bourgeoisie is real, while the mystical cabal of Jews controlling the world is not real. Sorry if this comes as a surprise to anyone. And I'm not arguing that this single show is going to make you change your mind about politics. Ideology is not enforced by a single voice, by one person telling you which things are good and which are bad. It is enforced by thousands of smaller, consistent voices, sending out consistent messages. How many times have you been watching a show or a movie or playing a video game or reading a book, and a revolutionary group fighting for equality against an oppressive ruling class shows up? How many times has there not been a reveal later in the story that there's some kind of dark underside to that group? That something about them is nefarious, or they're too ruthless in their pursuit of their cause, or their intentions aren't what they appear? I can name maybe Star Wars, where the politics of the rebellion are kept so vague that it almost doesn't count, but it hardly ever happens, does it? You are not immune to propaganda. This is why being critical of the political messages in fiction matters. Your brain isn't gonna go, oh, they're talking about bending, not the means of production, so I can disregard everything this is saying about revolutionary groups fighting for equality. Especially not when it's consistent with 100 other pieces of fiction you've enjoyed before.
Some so subtle you might not have even noticed, but your brain did.
So HFM was nothing but respectful to me in his video, and I don't want any of you goblins going and being shitty in his comments. Having said all of this, at the risk of getting a little more personal than I want to, there's one minor thing that really rubbed me the wrong way about his video, which is the way he regards the writers themselves. You know, the boys. There's this defensiveness of them, which I think is further shown in his pinned comment beneath the video, which says there's evidence outside the text that the writers were not that misinformed about communism and what it means, and that they meant something else. Many stories have suddenly become bad allegories for real-world things because they were never meant to be read as those allegories. He clearly likes this show and highly regards these two as writers, so some of the things I say in my videos are going to feel like pretty unjust attacks on them. Here's the thing, as we've established in this video, whether intentional or not, what they created does engage with ideas of communism. Whether or not to prize authorial intent above all else is a whole other discussion in literary criticism that we touched on but do not have time to fully go into here. But the consistency with which Season 1 of Korra reproduces these common anti-communist tropes means that what this show is saying about communism is either down to malice or ignorance. I have no reason to believe the former, but the latter is... it's a real Occam's razor situation here, because ignorance about communism is about as common as water, especially in the parts of the world that engaged in a decades-long ideological battle against communism in the Cold War, in which the most ludicrous, patently false criticisms you can imagine were levied against this ideology and America's geopolitical opponents that purported to represent it. And I don't know if you've seen a map lately, but America won the Cold War. Their narratives, their little version of reality got to be the dominant one. And there are countless people who pay attention to what's going on in the world and figure they're more or less clued in to politics, who have absorbed a ton of that propaganda and integrate it into how they engage with certain ideas. Even if the boys never once uttered the word communist or socialist while writing the series, the way they represent and narratively use this group, who is primarily struggling against an oppressor class for liberation, is the evidence that they're inundated with those anti-communist ideas about these topics. The point of my videos on this show is not to attack them as people or suggest that they're stupid. As I go into in the Season 4 video, it's to unpack how that ideological position that accepts the dominant ideology while presenting itself as impartially taking ideologues to task is not only extremely common in our media, but works to keep us ignorant. That is what media criticism should be for, not figuring out who is right or wrong about where a made-up guy would be on the political compass.